Hello and welcome back, and today we want to do another Plex Media Server test, and today we are looking at the QNAP TS-873A. It is their brand new 8-bay system that features that lovely Ryzen processor that we've talked about quite a lot over the last 6 to 8 months. Here it is here, but a few disclaimers straight off the bat. First and foremost, I am utilising a single GPU equipped laptop here for doing this Plex testing so we can get some real-time information. The result is occasionally you are going to hear the hum of the fans on the GPU inside that laptop. I'm going to try and remove those as best I can, but it's worth highlighting that. Secondly, you may see here a frankly comically large amount of memory. 62 gig, there is actually 64 gigabytes of memory inside this system. I'm using it for another test coming up very soon, where I'm showing what you can do by maxing out the memory on these systems, but this will not play a part in the test. We've done these tests before on multiple NASs, and very rarely will memory utilization creep above 3 to 4 gigabytes. So you can ignore that for now and mainly look on the right hand side of the screen, where we will be looking at CPU, memory and bandwidth at the top, representing what's going through the network. Throughout the course of the test, we will be playing different file types, the same file types we've always covered before, and I've got loads of NASs listed here, but we'll always make sure that this is the NAS we are utilising, the TS-873A. And we're going to start the way we always start these tests, with the matrix. I've not given this NAS enough time to scrape the metadata, so a lot of the images aren't here at the moment. It would normally happen like that, but just because I've got this lone unit for a little bit less time than I'd like to get a lot of these recordings done, so I'm making these a little bit quicker than I normally would. But for now, let's go ahead and play this file here. We've got this muted, and again we are using OBS for our screen recording here, so that may play its part if there's a little bit of a clipping there while we're going through stuff. Now, straight away, as we can see here, there's no dent at all. CPU, the tiniest little spike there, but really nothing worth being concerned with. We can flick around all we want. This is quite a low rent file. It's a 720p file that we're utilising here, and it's in its original kind of light format. If we go ahead and have the playback settings there, you can see it's playing in the original 0.7 megabits per second bit rate at 720p, and it's a standard 1080p file. So again, we can flick around, absolutely nothing to worry about. The odd little bump in the road with regard to the CPU utilisation, and again, we can separate it, but we're going to leave system in the background there underneath those lines, just to make sure in case something happens with the NAS, with the background process, so we know that that's relative to the Plex Media Server. So first, let's run ourselves some Plex Transcoding. Let's make our way and let's convert this to something a bit smaller. Let's convert to a 480p file. So instantaneous change there, very impressive. It's doubled the bit rate but lowered the picture quality quite noticeably. So again, very little going on with there. So we can, get rid of the bar there. We can't really tell at this resolution because 480p is still massively over-resed for what we're running here on screen. So what we're going to do now is go down a little bit more. We're going to cut down. Now we're going to crack on down to a crazy 160p. This is where there's going to be about 4 pixels on screen at any given time. And this is where one of the earliest tests that we do to tax these systems. There was a delay there of about 4 seconds while the system got ready, and you've already seen there on the right hand side of the screen that giant spike there in terms of CPU. It's going to come back down, and then every time we flick along, so if we leave that there on screen, we flick along to 101 hour 20 minutes, you can see there it will flick along. It is pixelated beyond all measure, almost unwatchable, but again, it's good to know that we can lower these resolutions if need be with the Ryzen V1500B non-GPU equipped CPU being able to do the job quite well. So I think that's enough for that 1080p file. We're going to make our way back to films on the 873A, and this time we're going to make our way to Little Shop of Horrors. That is our 1080p test file that we always run at H264, so there's none of the HEV or 10-bit stuff here. We can go ahead and play that file straight away, and again, in the original format, this plays absolutely easily. We can flick around. We're playing this over the network, and it's worth also remembering I am watching this over Wi-Fi. So if we open up my task manager very quickly, you're able to see right now that Chrome is obviously using a lot of memory, as Chrome always does. I've got all manner of tabs open, 43 tabs in fact. But right now, if we look at the network, very little network being utilized anyway. So we can see straight away that in the original format, nothing's troubling this CPU. So let's, once again, that fan on my laptop is starting to ramp up a little bit there. Let's crack this down now to 720p. So at 720p, we can see a little bit more activity as we go through. Bear in mind that even when you are transcoding, you are still going to be utilizing some of the resources on your host system. But again, this kind of drop down is very, very minimal. 1080p to 720, particularly at the bit rate being as it is. We can flick around with absolutely no concerns whatsoever there as we go along. Very little impact there as well. So let's do something a little bit more aggressive now. We're going to go to one of the middling bit rates. This one here, 328p, otherwise known as the what the hell are you doing picture quality. Some of these middling ones are the ones where NASes do tend to have difficulty. They're not preset values. There'll be a little bit of a spike, as you see there. It's very brief, but most certainly noticeable there. And as we flick along the timeline, the CPU is going to struggle. Memory, as you can see, very little in the grand scheme of things. And as you can see here from QNAP's own measurements here at the top of the screen, a little bit more analytical, all that excess memory we popped inside is not making any impact. But the CPU has had to work hard for that transcoding, particularly the change. But as you can see, it's coming back down there with a suitable area of buffering there for the file. So again, let's bring this right the way down to the bottom. Let's gutterball this file down to 160p. We should see the inevitable terrible spike, as now we've converted this 1080p file down to potato quality. And as we let it go along there, we've got the spike as we've always seen before. But this time I think that spike's going to level out for a little bit more time. Each time we do that, I mean, look, that was half the spike of the previous. And that was when I flicked around the channel several times. So it's going to be interesting to see the impact of that long term when we make our way into our much higher definition files very shortly. And again, never overlook the impact of OBS during the course of these tests. But for now, I think that's enough information on our 1080p file there, so we can come out of it there. And now we're going to go on to those always fun jellyfish files. These are the ones where we take advantage of some real dense media. These are 30-second files, only 30 seconds long, but they scale from a very approachable and easy 1080p H.264 up to a massive and aggressive as hell 200 megabits per second 4K UHD 10-bit Hevc file. This is an absolute killer of a file and will really test most systems. I very much doubt it will play the bottom end with that Ryzen being non-GPU, but let's find out. So let's start early doors with the jellyfish file here. This is our standard 1080p 3 megabits per second. The things to look for during these tests is the darker orange. That is the buffering. That is the system planning ahead for the amount of the file it's been able to push through as quickly as possible. And being a 30-second file, the key is to make sure that playback does not outpace buffering. And as the tests get more and more complex, the system has to work harder for that buffering, and consequently, you end up with a situation where the file just kicks out. So again, let's try that file again, but this time we're going to go ahead and play with the file a little bit. We're going to transcode this file down to 240p. We're going to see that spike, and again, as you see, the buffering was nowhere near as quick as it was before, but it does happen to get there in the end. And again, nice and straightforward. And at this file type here, this file is actually pretty small. It's only when we reach the real hefty files, because even though all of these are 30 seconds long, it's worth highlighting that the first file is about 10 megs in size. The last file is 1.4 gigabytes. 30-second long file, and it's 1.4 gigabytes. So a huge amount of data to be playing with. Oh yeah, there's the 400 as well. So now we're going to move on to an Hevc file and an Hevc 10-bit. Let's go straight for the Hevc 10-bit. Now this is known as HDR. This is where you will see automatic conversions take place. Because of the file type being so large, Hevc is, otherwise known as H.265, is a much more impressive compression technique that allows even better picture quality files to exist, and allows larger, huge, think of Avengers 4K UHD, to be compressed enough to be watched at home. But in most cases, devices either need to have sufficient power to convert and play them back like so, or they need licenses in order to be able to play those files. An example, if we go back to the QNAP here, if you go into the Application Center, you have something called Cyan Player. And Cyan Player, or Cyan Player, however one wants to pronounce it, is a tool that allows you to take advantage of Hevc and H.265, including support of the license as well to play back those files. That's something that's really only available on QNAP at the moment, but hopefully will become broader over time. So if we go back to that 10-bit file and play that one, but this time we're going to go for that hefty conversion. We're going to let it play, and this time we're going to go down to 160p. We are going to see this NAS struggle. You can see it did play it, and it converted it and buffered it a little slower than before, but the utilization spiked up immediately. And that's definitely worth bearing in mind on a system like this when you are thinking about having a nice mid-priced Plex Media server, but want to know that that CPU's got some future-proofing in it. So moving away from the single digit bit rates, we're going to jump a few steps up to the 10 megabits per second, because we're going to largely avoid the majority of H.264 files simply because H.264, we know the system isn't going to struggle. I could select a particularly hefty H.264 like this one, and it's still going to play it pretty well. H.264 is handled very, very well, and you can see the buffering is far outpacing that of the playback there. So even though this file's 30 seconds long, it's still going to outpace it. Only just at this level, but it's still able to outpace it. Although, look at that, it's caught up, and it's about to outpace it. So I think that's kind of the limit on H.264, or non-HDR. But if we go back, now we can look at some of this heftier stuff. So for now, let's go with the 10 megabits per second HEV 10-bit HDMI 1080p file. Open that there. As always, it's going to automatically convert because it's an HEVC or H.265 file. But I think it can be said there that that file is going to go ahead and transcode ahead of the game, and it's going to get the job done for us. So we see, carried on all the way through to the end. We're not going to have to re-watch the whole thing. So for now, let's go and do a conversion, this time down to 480p. And we'll see how it copes with it. The buffering was pretty quick there. Just ahead, we're noticing the spike on the CPU utilization once again, with memory doing practically nothing there. We're just letting that do its jam there as everything carries on. But it seemed like it didn't have too much difficulty combating that file. So now we're going to move up to 30. So that's going to be the 30 megabits per second HEVC. So again, non-10-bit media, but still pretty dense. Leave that to do its original conversion. Let that carry on. The buffering certainly this time has slowed down. And look at the spike there on the CPU utilization. It's once again spiked up. It's also worth highlighting while I'm doing this. Once we do the next conversion, it did buffer it right there. So let's rewind that back and then do a fresh conversion. Bring it down even lower. We'll go for 240p. While it does that, it's worth highlighting that we're now entering the file formats, bit rates, and file types that are a little bit rarer. These are the real top end. If you've bought an OLED TV or a QLED in the last year or so, maybe you bought one of those HDMI 2.1 TVs like I did for the PS5, you bought some high-def TV, you're going to need TVs like that to really appreciate a lot of the file formats that we're going to be starting to go into. These are the ones where movies arrive at close to 100 gig each in size. Bear that in mind. Remember, 30-second files, we're entering the area where these files are 1 gig in size. So that's 100 megabits per second HEVC file, and after this we're making our way into 4K. So we're going to let that carry on. The buffering is happening there in the background. But again, much slower buffering this time, carrying on there. And I think it will just about outpace playback, but not by a huge degree. If we were to play around and fast forward to a later area in the file, I don't think this system will be able to stay on top of that. We may be hitting the peak of what this system can comfortably accommodate at HEVC, with the CPU maxing out in its utilization, but it managed to play it nonetheless. So for now, we're now going to move into 4K. Again, we're going to avoid H.264. We're going straight into the 10-bit media. This is our 120 megabits per second 4K UHD HEVC 10-bit 4K file. Woof, what a mouthful that was. And this is where we're going to see some Plex troubles. Now, again, we are using a Plex pass. So we are, if we did have a GPU-equipped CPU, we would be taking advantage of hardware transcoding. Unfortunately, this means we have to rely on software transcoding right now, and buffering is happening. You can see it there. I'm trying to track it with the mouse there. And I think chances are it might just outpace playback. Oh no, I don't think it will. I think playback is ultimately going to win this. It's snailing ahead of playback there, that buffering. I hope that's coming out quite clear to you guys watching this test, but look at it there. I think it's going to lose the race. It's catching up. I'm afraid, no, it's hit the wall, and I think this is where it caught up, and it had to have a pause there for the buffering to outpace playback. At least it played the file. That's one thing we can say. So now we're going to move into the big leagues, the 2 and the 400 file. We're going to play all three of these. Let's play the last H.264 file. I know I said we wouldn't, but it'd be worth it to see if it can play the 4K H.264 the 200 megabits per second file. Let's have a look there. It's playing in its original picture quality, of course. Buffering has reached 5 seconds and petered out. It's also worth highlighting, if you have a look up here, that the CPU has given up. It's realised it can't do it, and it's just bottomed out. Now we could try to transcode automatically, just like it would with an H.265 or HEVC file. And we have a look there. Buffering still at 5. We are starting to see a spike in the CPU utilization as it changes gears. But I really don't think at this rate of buffering here, of the creation there in the background, it's not going to be able to do it. It's going to play the file in a second if we're lucky, but I just can't see playback not being absolutely terrible here. Buffering's up to here right now, but I think because it's an H.264, we're seeing something, fair play, it does look like it's going to outpace it, but even then, we've largely had to dominate the system resources in order for that to ultimately outpace it. So the final two tests now, we're going to go into that same file, but this time it's the HEV 10-bit version. And given what we saw before, I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't really have our expectations too high here. The fact that it's, the CPU spike is clear there. We are seeing it trying, and we are seeing the buffering happen there. But given that it's not even converted a third of this HEVC file yet, and the playback has begun, I think this is much like our previous test of the 10-bit 4K file. I think we are going to see the end of the road here, and either the CPU is going to gut a ball out and kick us out, or it's going to need more time to allow it to encode that file. As you can see, the playback has hit the conversion there. Conversion just going to need a little bit more. I mean, it's been able to play the file, and maybe if you gave it a bit more time to convert the file, then nope, it's gutterballed us and kicked us out. And finally, we've got the 400 megabits per second file. Now, bear in mind, again, this is a 1.4 gigabytes 30-second file, which is comical. That means every minute would have to be 2.8 gigabytes if it was a movie file. Now, again, very few common day files like this exist. And if you do use a camera that records at this quality, you know that editing files like this are near enough impossible. If you're going to deal with files like this, you've got to be using an Intel Core, an i3-57, maybe even a 9, or you've got to start looking at maybe like the Xeon W series, which has embedded graphics. Embedded graphics is the name of the game here because you need a tailored part of that CPU to take care of this. If we press play and allow it to try to play that file, I reckon it'll try. It'll maybe even get some of the buffering, but the playback is going to wildly outpace the converting there of the CPU. This has not been a NAS that I would say people should buy for Plex. Generally, it's one for small, medium business or SMB users, but nevertheless, we are still seeing some great performance and some good fight back from a processor that doesn't have embedded graphics, when previous generations of this series and other non-GPU equipped CPUs, the ones that we've seen in the previous AMD series from QNAP in their 73s, and we've seen in the Atom series in previous NAS, that wouldn't have got anywhere close to where we are. But still, nevertheless, has to be said that I would call this not a success right now. We're seeing that playback, and it's managed the file. Fair play to it. It's managed it, but the conversion there is still a bit of a hassle. So I probably wouldn't recommend this NAS for top-end Plex Media Server use, but certainly if you're looking for something in the middle, or you're looking to play files up to, I would say, a standard degree of 4K, and standard being that 120 megs, anything above that I would call superimposing, and, future-proofing, but still fantastically aggressive, but nevertheless, this has been our Plex Media Server testing of the QNAP TS-873A. I hope you found it helpful. There should be a link in the description where we've broken down today's results into lots of screen grabs and information without you having to watch the whole thing, and get a little bit more precise information about different codecs and different file formats. If you've enjoyed the video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. I hope OBS hasn't knackered any parts of this video in the background. And if you do enjoy stuff like this, do let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, where we will be doing a new series of Plex tests very, very soon. We're changing things up a bit, revisiting a lot of our old NASes in a new way to test Plex for you guys who want to use these in a home environment and find these tests a little bit too analytical for your taste. Otherwise, I will see you next time.